So we're opening the public policy stage at AIUK with the directors of public policy at the Alan Turing Institute who curated this stage. They're going to tell you about the role of AI and data science in public policy and some of the world-leading content you're going to hear about over the next 2 days. So it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. Professor Helen Margetts is a Turing Fellow and a Director of the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute, and also Professor of Society and the Internet at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She's a political scientist who specialises in the relationship between government politics and technology, and also the author of hundreds of publications, including the prize-winning books, Political Turbulence and Digital Era Governance. She also sits on the UK Government's Digital Economy Council, the Home Office Scientific Advisory Council, and the board of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Joining her is Dr. Cosmina Dorobantu. Cosmina is the co-director of the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute, and she's an economist with an interest in working with unconventional data and new modelling approaches to improve policymakers' understanding of the world. She sits on various expert groups, including the Financial Conduct Authority, the Bank of England's Financial Services Artificial Intelligence Public-Private Forum, and the Department for International Trade's Trade and Economy panel. Prior to joining the Turing, Cosmina was a co-founder and executive director of the largest power market analytics company in Europe, and she also spent 5 years at Google, shaping the company's investment and business strategy in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So if you have any questions for Helen or Cosmina, put them into the box at any time, and at the end of the session, I will ask as many as we have time for. And now, over to you, Helen and Cosmina.
Thank you, Tamandra, and thanks everybody for coming to, for choosing the public policy stage. So on this stage and in the programme that Cosmina and I direct, we think about artificial intelligence from a public sector perspective. In the excuse me, in the early days of AI, the emphasis has been on technology produced by the private sector for the private sector. And we want to move to thinking in parallel about what AI could do for government. How can it help us to make better public policy and design better services? And that's what we're going to be talking about over the 2 days. So what's the dream here? Say we really kind of achieved our aims, what would be the dream? And we are motivated by the point that data science and AI have enormous potential to make government better. They have the possibility to tailor education to the needs of each child, tailored to their kind of ways of learning and ways of achieving. We have the possibility to reduce crime of all kinds. For example, on the street, how can we foresee or even predict where crime is likely to happen to such a fine degree that we can think about preventing it before it's even taken place? How can we allocate scarce resources like police time to the right places? So again, with this kind of preventative idea. How can we fit healthcare to every patient? How can we think about each patient in terms of their genetic makeup, for example? What kind of medication will suit them best? What kind of healthcare plan will tackle their health problems? How can we build economic models that are so beyond what we have at the moment that we can actually understand when something like a financial crisis is going to happen, not something that happened in the financial crisis of 2008, which remained unpredicted. Why? Because a lot of economic models actually had built into them the assumption that such a thing couldn't happen. Same for negative oil prices. Well, that doesn't seem very likely at the moment, but that was something that happened at the beginning of the pandemic. Again, models of commodity markets were built to assume that couldn't happen. Traffic deaths. Could we aspire to zero traffic deaths if we have autonomous vehicles, for example, and if we have methods of kind of foreseeing where accidents are going to happen and designing some kind of prevention into traffic systems? How can we intervene earlier for vulnerable individuals, children at risk of some violent or abusive incident? If we could work out when that was going to happen, we could make those children safe before it happened. Again, this is a kind of an ultimate dream. How can we use AI with these kind of noble aims in mind? And indeed, the overarching aim: how can we make government more efficient, fairer, more responsive, and more resilient to shocks like financial crises or pandemics or war or so on? One piece of good news here is that governments, and these are figures for the UK government, but it's true across the world, governments are really interested in AI, and that hasn't been the case necessarily with earlier computer technologies. I wrote my PhD thesis a very long time ago about government information systems in the UK and the US. At that time, computer projects was something that officials ran away from. Policymakers didn't want anything to do with because they were always going wrong. There's much more excitement and interest in AI. And if you look at that figures, that's some evidence to suggest that's the case. Hardly anything in 2015, going all the way with a blip during the pandemic, which is understandable. In 2021, 350 mentions of AI in government publications. Really strong interest, and that's positive. You can do more with something you're excited about. And a real recognition of the potential of these technologies for public good, as well as private good and economic profit. We want the public sector to understand AI. There are huge opportunities for government to capitalise on this technology to improve lives. That's a quote from the foreword to a guidance we wrote for the ethics of the public sector back in 2019. 2020, the National Data Strategy, harnessing the power of data to improve public services and position the UK as a forerunner of the next wave of innovation. And then the National AI Strategy, and there is a National AI Strategy, AI central to how we drive growth and enrich lives. All positive signs about how the policy-making world is receiving AI. So in this session, we want to talk a little bit about how the Alan Turing Institute and our programme is trying to help with that, and then get a bit more specific to look at the actual tasks that data science and AI are really good for that might help policy making, and tell you a little bit about the next 2 days. So in the very early days of the Turing Institute, before the programme started, we wanted to think about this question of AI in the public sector. We went all around government, talking to people inside government, talking about policy problems, administrative problems, and what these technologies might do to help. We received a lot of interest, as I've already suggested. We also we heard a lot of different kind of issues, and some of them were quite a surprise to us. For example, around half of the issues that people raised had to do with the ethics of these technologies. People were as well as worrying about how they could do some of these things, how they could overcome lack of technological expertise, for example, in public service. They were also very interested in what they should do and worried about the things that they shouldn't do. So when we formed the programme, when we actually launched the programme, we set ourselves these kind of twin pillars of objectives. Some of them were about the technology and how government could get the expertise to use these technologies, and the others were about these ethical questions. On the yellow side, the tech issues: how can we actually use AI to inform policy making, make better decisions, improve the design and provision of public services? And then on the red side, these more normative questions: how can you build the ethical foundations for the use of data science and AI that would be enabling? The word ethics, as in the past, in the technology world, had quite a negative connotation that was going to stop people doing things. We wanted to enable the use of these technologies. And we also wanted to contribute to the policy that governs the use of data science and AI. I'm talking about regulation and standards, what you need to make sure that data science and AI are both safe and ethical. So we set up a number of research projects. We've grown a lot over the time. Altogether we've run about 50 research projects. We have about 45 researchers in our team. We work with over 20 universities, and we work with over 90 public sector bodies, with running all the way from kind of strategic partnerships to just offers of advice and help and discussion and convening. So that's a lot of activity going on, and what are we actually doing, though? Instead of talking about the exciting possibilities, what are we actually doing? Well, just to take one step back here, artificial intelligence has really captured the public imagination. It's in the press all the time. You're all here. If we'd set up a talk about technology and public policy, say even 10 years ago, none of you would probably have come. It's really captured the public imagination, from dancing robots, there's Boston Dynamics Spot, to driverless cars already beginning to be prototyped on our streets. It's really captured the public imagination. And in the private sector, but something to really remember here is it's not a completely new field. It's important. It's new in terms of scale, but none of the things that make up these technologies are actually new. These technologies, they need data, they need storage, they need computing power, and they need algorithms. All those things were there in the very early days of government computing, in the very early days of computing. But what's happened is all of those have really, really scaled up, and we've got far, far more data, particularly driven by the platform giants based on consumer technology, with huge amounts of data. We've got far more storage capability than we've ever had. We've got far more computing power than we've ever had. And we've had far better algorithms and greater investment put into the development of algorithms than we've ever had before. And that means that AI has become a kind of game changer, if you like. It's a question of scale with each of that thing, but that has added up to a game changer. And one of the important things to remember about AI is it's a kind of general purpose technology. It gets into everything. So if you think of those wavy lines, those wavy lines as financial services, as one example, AI gets into how we deal with email spam, how we deliver how we make the environment secure, how we trade, how traders operate, capital optimization, fraud detection, right the way along the kind of production line of financial services, customer support and chatbots, claim management, loan decisions, and underwriting insurance. All those things are already using AI, are powered by AI. And the important point to note here is that it's a kind of horizontal technology which gets into everything, and that's what makes it a potential game changer. Now, if you're very positive about AI, then you see tremendous possibilities for automation, innovation, and efficiency coming from that sort of pervasive characteristic of AI. If you're more pessimistic, then you see unemployment springing up everywhere. You see inequality. You see monopolies, the platform giants just dominating the scene. And you see instability caused by the fact that AI gets into everything, that all systems are linked. And those are the sort of most positive and most negative. But the point to make is this characteristic of getting into everything. So that means when we think about AI for the public sector, we have to think about the actual generic tasks that might be used in any policy or any service and how AI can help with those. We need to think about, and these are the tasks that after a lot of thinking and working in this area, we've kind of identified as those generic tasks. One of them is simulation. How can you simulate policies before putting them into practice? and working out what any unintended consequences might be and avoiding them. How can we detect unwanted behaviour? Detective capability is one of the core functions of government. And how can we measure that unwanted behaviour, look at trends and try and do something about it? How can we predict where things are going to happen? How can we predict which startups will be successful or where something bad is going to happen, like some kind of financial crisis or a pandemic? How can we work towards personalising? That's something that we know these technologies really well for. That's what they're used for so much in the advertising agency, for example, personalisation. We have far more possibility of personalisation than before. And finally, this question of ethics and governance. Again, this kind of double-edged sword. On the one hand, these technologies are have been all kinds of unethical uses of these technologies can be pointed to, and kind of sort of worrying possibilities of bias, of lack of accountability, control and transparency. At the same time, because they work on data about people generated by the existing system, they can also highlight for the first time bias in decision making, for example, make it explicit, and thereby make it more possible that we might do something about it. And just before I hand over to Cosmina, it's important to make the point that, yes, that's a horizontal technology that goes across every single policy area, those tasks. We could point to examples in, don't worry, we won't, but we could point to examples in every one of those boxes in every single policy area. But at the same time, you have to think about it in a vertical way as well, thinking of how those tasks could work in each policy area. And I'm going to hand over to Cosmina to say a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Helen. So it's on to me to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing in each one of those categories and how we think about them, and what you're going to be seeing in the next 2 days on this stage. So when it comes to simulation and evaluation, as Helen mentioned, we want to understand the impact of policy interventions, and we now have the modeling capabilities to do that. Now, we didn't actually have those modeling capabilities in the past. All of our modeling efforts have been hindered by the data that we had available to us. So the approaches that we have developed as researchers and policymakers in the past have been to model our world from the top down. We only had aggregate data, so we started with aggregate data, and we used that to try to understand complex interdependent systems. So what did this mean in practice? Well, for example, in the past, if we wanted to understand the density of cars in the road, we modeled that as a function of the total population in an area, the number of roads, and the sort of size of the economy. If we wanted to try to understand, for example, the casualties in a war, we would look at the opposing sides and the rules of engagement between them. And if we wanted to understand our economies, and this is something that central banks still do these days, we use a model that is based on aggregate data and has one representative agent. So, these were great modeling approaches for the data that we had at the time. But right now we have individual level data, and with that data we can actually do much better because we can model our systems from the bottom up using approaches such as agent computing. So how does that work? Well, instead of taking an aggregate approach, we can start with the individual. So we can build individual software agents. They can be heterogeneous, much like we are, much like our firms are, much like daily life is, based on the microdata that we have about each individual in each firm. We can give them goals and incentives like all of us have in real life. And we can make them interactive, so we can make them part of a network like we are part of various networks into our own lives. Now, why is that exciting? Well, it's exciting because instead of modeling the world as we used to, now we can actually, if we want to understand traffic, we can model each vehicle, road, and get the emerging traffic jams from that. If we want to understand military conflict, we can now model each soldier and weapon and bullet and try to understand that. And when it comes to the economy, and as Helen said, our abilities to foresee our next financial and address our next financial crisis, we can model each person, job, firm, and job switch, which gives us a much better understanding of what's actually happening in our world. Now, at the Turing, we have an entire area of work dedicated to modeling for policy, headed up by Dr. Omar Guerrero, who's our head of computational social science research. And you will be hearing from them twice today on the stage. The first session is AI for policymaking, which is right after this one. It's going to start at 11 o'clock. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at in that session is an agent computing approach to modeling labor mobility within the UK. Now, this is a project where we've been working with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And what we try to do is, when we're looking at the labor market and the labor market dynamics within the UK, instead of modeling from aggregates, from the total number of unemployed, we started building a model with individuals, just workers looking for jobs on a network. And we've been able to do some very exciting work with that model. For example, look at furlough scenarios and simulations and understand the effects on labor flows and unemployment duration. So we'll introduce that model to you and have a panel discussion with our government partners at 11. And besides the first session, the other exciting session that we have is going to be towards the end of today, starting at 4 p.m. And it's going to look at the role of computational social science in policymaking. And if we hear from policymakers in the morning about the potential of those technologies for simulation and evaluation, in the afternoon, we're going to hear from the researchers, some of the top research academics in the world who have built the foundations in computational social science. Great. Well, moving on to the other tasks, measurement and detection, prediction and forecasting, and personalization. So the technological hero behind these tasks is machine learning. And this is the crudest introduction that I can give you to supervise machine learning in 30 seconds. But what's exciting about machine learning is that back in the day, if we wanted to write a piece of software that would identify a dog in an image, what we had to do is write the rules of what makes a dog a dog. So we tried to program what we can so easily recognize in daily life. But what machine learning does is that it takes that need away to define what is a dog. And all we need to do is feed an algorithm images of dogs and labels, letting it know that it is a dog. And over time, the system learns on its own what makes a dog a dog. And this is a huge shift in the way we program. Now, what matters for machine learning? Well, obviously the algorithm itself, the piece of code. The quantity of the data that we feed it matters. So if you only give it 10 pictures of dogs, it's going to have a hard time learning what makes a dog a dog. The quality of the data matters. So if I feed it images of cats labeled as dogs, it's never going to know what a dog is. And the variation in data. So if I only feed it images that look like this dog, it's never going to be able to recognize, say, a Labrador or a giant schnauzer. Now, what can machine learning do for measurement and detection? This is one of the tasks that is highly important for government because you need to be able to measure something in order to understand it and address it. And here we're gonna go over our work into online harm. So this afternoon, right after lunch at 4 p.m., you're gonna hear about our online harms observatory, which is a new analytics platform that tracks in real time harmful content online. And this is a very exciting piece of work that emerged out of our work on hate speech. So we've set up a project at the Turing a few years ago, which attempted to measure, analyze, and counter online hate speech with advanced computational methods. And it's a highly exciting project for us because it's a marriage of machine learning, social science, and policy interventions. So when you ask the question, how can we measure online hate, that's a machine learning question. And when you ask how is hate organized and what is hate, that is very much a social science question. And when you ask how can we challenge it, that's a policy intervention. So please tune in at 2 to see how we've turned this project into an actual observatory meant to help policymakers understand online harmful content. And right after the session in which we introduced this new analytics platform, we're going to have a session, a panel discussion on the future of regulation for online safety, where we're going to be hearing from the key players behind the online safety bill here in the UK. And it's a very exciting initiative and a groundbreaking initiative. So it would be very interesting to hear from the people who were actually working on it. Now, when it comes to prediction and forecasting and personalization, what we do know is that the private sector is using machine learning to personalize their services and predict what users want. So you only have to think back at your Netflix account. You know, it usually has the top picks for you based on what you've been viewing and the profile that the companies have on you. It's the same with Amazon. We get personalized offerings online. But within the public sector, we see much less of that. So what we're trying to do at the Turing is bring this area of prediction, forecasting, and personalization based on machine learning into the heart of government. And today we will be launching a new program of research at the Institute, headed up by Jonathan Bright, whom you're going to be hearing from also today at noon. He's going to be leading a panel with government partners looking at the use of machine learning in public services. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And what is the Turing planning on doing to get this area of work off the ground? And last, but certainly not least, ethics and governments. And this is a hugely important area of work, and it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be foundational in everything that we do, especially when we consider the use of these technologies in a public sector context. And we'll be covering all of day 2 at AIUK on the stage is going to be dedicated to ethics and governance. And we're going to start by looking at standards and regulation. And standards and regulation are hugely important. You know, as Helen said, AI has been capturing the public's imagination with pictures of dancing robots and driverless cars. And it also captures the public imagination in terms of risk. We sometimes fear, you know, hapless robots taking over the world and you know, surpassing the intelligence of their creators. But you know, those sort of dystopian views of the future ignore the fact that humans are very much in the driving seat of those technologies. And regulation and standards are the tools that we have to set the guardrails in place for innovation in this space. So we will start tomorrow at 9:30 with a session about building the AI Standards Hub. And this is a very exciting initiative that's being hosted at the Turing. The Turing is the official host of the pilot phase of the AI Standards Hub. It's an initiative that is sponsored by the UK government through the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and the Office for Artificial Intelligence, with partners BSI and NPL. Now, standards are increasingly important as a governance and innovation mechanism. And the AI Standards Hub will have sort of 4 pillars of activity. We're going to have an online platform that will act as an AI standards observatory, collating the information that we have about the standards that are being developed in this space. We want the hub to be a place where people connect and we have a community building around this idea of AI standards. Where the 3rd pillar of activity is going to be based on education, training, and professional development. And the 4th, because it is the Turing and we are a research organization, we're going to be working on research and analysis to understand how to best build AI standards. So we're going to start tomorrow with that session on building the AI Standards Hub, and then we're going to follow it up with a session on regulation in the age of AI. And this is something that is, much like standards, very important to us. And I think, just to sort of give you an example, we're all looking with horror to witness what's happening in Ukraine these days. And nuclear war is back on our agendas in a way that it hasn't been in a very long time. And I think, as we're pondering the sort of 13,000 nukes that the world powers are sitting on, you can't help but wonder, what would the world have looked like if technological innovation in the early 1940s in the form of atomic bombs hadn't bolted ahead of regulation and sort of sensible thought. So with AI, we're nowhere near that point of innovation getting ahead of us. But we do have a collective responsibility as we're building AI strategies and wondering how our economies can take advantage of it and how we can grow this industry. We have a responsibility to set the guardrails in place, and we have time to do that. So regulation is going to play a key role, and our session tomorrow is going to be touching upon that. And then we're going to look, tomorrow afternoon is going to be dedicated to AI ethics. And the first two sessions, the first bit of that from 1 to 3 p.m. is going to be dedicated to the global partnership of AI and their work on international collaboration in AI and data governance. We're going to hear from Chris Philp, the Minister of Technology and Digital Economy, at 1 o'clock. Who's going to be telling us about this collaboration and this work. And we will be hearing from, among others, and our global partners on this, from our own researchers at the Turing and their work on advancing data justice research and practice. We're going to be launching a new report that we have been writing and working on at the Institute alongside global partners. What's interesting and important about data justice, we launched an interim report in the fall, but we're going to have the final version of this report with you tomorrow. What's really exciting about this is that when we're thinking about data ethics and data governance, we used to think about privacy and individual autonomy and sort of mechanisms to minimize these harms. But actually, data governance is much more than that, and the concept of data justice is trying to look at that. It's trying to look at the social structures that are generating the data and defining their use. It's trying to look at the human choices between the data, our data collection practices, and it's looking at the social technical processes that go into the data that we have to work with for these technologies and the data that we're collecting. So what we will be seeing in our report tomorrow is the current state of research, practical guides on how to build data justice practices when building those technologies, and also what is most exciting about the work is that we took a participatory design in which we worked, as I mentioned, with partners from around the world. And then we will close the stage tomorrow with a session on intercultural and global AI ethics. And UNESCO's Gabriela Ramos is going to be giving the keynote speech for our last and closing session on this stage. What's really important about UNESCO's work is that, we witnessed a historical moment last fall when UNESCO launched its recommendations on AI ethics. And it's the first global agreement of its kind, which was adopted by 193 member states. And look, AI is a general purpose technology. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And international collaboration is going to be key to how we're going to be building and how we're going to be targeting these technologies towards the public good and minimizing the risks that they pose. And it is crucial for us to take an international approach. It is also crucial to take an intercultural approach. So a lot of the sort of ethics work that we see these days, a lot of the guidelines that we see published have a very sort of Western perspective, and it's important to consider the perspectives of other cultures, not just the ones that we're sitting with. So I think this is the perfect way we thought of closing the session, of bringing to light just how international those issues are and how crucial it is that we all work together on them. So just a reminder of the tasks that we think data science and AI can really help. We've gone through them today, and I think the take-home message from this talk is that there's huge potential for these technologies when built responsibly to make our world a better place. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for paying attention, and happy to take questions from you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I have a couple of questions. The first one's a very general one, I think, provoked by the beginning of your introduction here. You seem to suggest that although AI and data are relatively new and unused in public policy, but they have obviously been around for quite a long time in industry and private enterprise. Do you think that public policy and policymakers have been slow to adopt these technologies? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, I think the kind of history of government and the way government is organised is part of the clue here. Governments have struggled with technology projects, as I mentioned. They've struggled to get the expertise. They've struggled to build successful contract relationships or to pay the salaries that the private sector can pay, and so on. I mean, if you think of the core competency of government, it's like bureaucracy. It is not big tech, But the distinctive thing about the latest generation of technologies is that they're data-driven. The technologies we're talking about are data-driven. And government has no tradition of using transactional data, the data that's generated by going about its business, for policymaking or designing services. The traditional model of government bureaucracy, all the data is in the files, literally, as Weber called them, originally on paper, and then when it was first computerized, the computerization just sort of replicated the files. You could find individual pieces of data about individual citizens, but there was no usable data generated for analysis. So that makes the possibilities so much more because it's not something that's been done before, but it also makes it a challenge because there isn't that tradition of using technology in this way, technology and data in this way.
It's very striking how hard it is now to talk about data without talking about AI, and how hard it is to talk about artificial intelligence without talking about data. And I think your introduction really brought that out, that the two are symbiotic now. What kind of new challenges do you think that throws up in terms of public policy use? Because obviously in the past, as you say, there would have been information and data there, but the idea of then using that for purposes other than the ones it was collected for wasn't really such a live issue. So do you think this throws up new challenges, both practically but also maybe ethically for governments about using either data they already have or new data they might have access to?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have to think about, the possibility, and what's exciting about this work is that we're used to thinking about sort of the Googles and the Facebooks of the world as the huge data holders. But actually governments are huge data holders, and that's something that we don't think about because, as Helen said, it's not really in a usable format. But of course, all of that data, it is highly sensitive data, and we have to be very careful about how we use it. And this is why I think, especially when you think about the use of those technologies in a public sector setting, we absolutely have to make ethics part of the process. And with the first key publication that we've written within the public policy program was a guide on the responsible use of these technologies in government. But I think even on the ethics side, if on the data side, what's exciting about government is that it is a huge holder of data. On the ethics side, what makes this a particularly good ground to set the direction for AI ethics in general is that the aim of public sector work is the public good. And if you start to think about AI ethics from a public good perspective, you come up with the right frameworks. I think that is something that the public sector in general has a responsibility to do and to set the sort of direction of travel there. You cannot do that from a private sector company. You see sort of value statements of private sector companies, and one of the value statements is our responsibilities to the shareholders. Okay, it's very hard to build AI ethics based on that. Well, in the public sector, the responsibility is the public good, and that's where ethics should start.
And finally, because I think we want to have a little break before the last session, one of the ways we often think about data, certainly for public use and public policy, is simply that you can gather information and you can process information more efficiently. And so in a sense, the idea is that you maybe are only doing the same thing, but you're doing it more efficiently. And although the downside of that is you perhaps you lose some human jobs and you can automate some processes, and the upside is that in this era of great shortage of public money, you can do the same thing cheaper. But if you think of the private sector, of course, we have gone very far beyond that AI and data have gone far beyond doing the same thing more efficiently and is revolutionising how we do things and even the things that can be done. Do you have a vision of that in public policy, that perhaps the things that policymakers can do for the public good could be completely transformed by using these technologies?
Yeah, I think it comes down to those sort of generic tasks that we were both talking about. I think, take prediction and foresight. That's something that government organisations have not been known for. It's kind of because it's just been too difficult in a way, I guess. So yes, I think government organisations are going to be doing things that they really haven't been done before, and also, this question of the ethical challenges of overcoming those and government being better than it was before, I think is really important. We've always known that elements of our criminal justice system is kind of biased. We've always felt that and discussed it, but it hasn't. This lays that explicitly kind of bare. And forces us to think about how it can be better. If you think about, the use of AI for hiring systems, what they're generally doing is revealing all sorts of decisions we used to make in the past, which were biased. And for the first time, we actually might really look at that explicitly and try and tackle it, and that's really exciting.
So one of the benefits, ironically, could be that instead of automating things that we previously did, it forces us to acknowledge things that we previously did without knowing, because we're having to write them into a program.
Exactly. You quite often have to make the sort of processes much more explicit than you ever made them before.
So we might understand ourselves better as decision makers.
I hope so.
I think the one other thing that I would add to that is that we're used to sort of thinking about these technologies as replicating what we're doing, and this is what makes them intelligent. And I think that has been a focus in the private sector as well. How can we get a machine to do what we do? But what is very exciting about these technologies in a public sector context is, how can we get these technologies to do what we cannot do? And one of the things that we cannot do, that our brains are incapable of doing, is integrating various areas of knowledge. So, for example, if I want to model, an entire economy or an entire policy space, all of the policy areas are interdependent. Our minds aren't big enough to capture all of those interdependencies and to know, for example, what will be the total effect of a policy of, in health, for example, of an investment in health. And this is where AI can help, because we can bring all of those multiple systems and actually link them together and be able to simulate our world and understanding much better in a way that our human brains simply aren't big enough to do.
We've actually had, as always is the case, whether live or streaming, We've had some new questions squeaked in, so I'm going to just throw them at you and hope you can still fit in a little break before 11 o'clock. So some of these are quite specific. One of them is very specific, so I'll start with that one. You mentioned that AI is regarded as a general purpose technology. What do you think about the lobby to exclude general purpose AI from the EU AI Act? This may be too specific to throw at you as a curveball question, but if you have thoughts, then Tessa Derbyshire would like to know them.
Well, I guess when we were talking about it being a general purpose technology, we were talking about the fact that it kind of potentially gets into every single task or decision-making process that you're doing. We weren't talking about general AI. We're talking about the use of AI for particular tasks. So
we're not talking about the...
we're not talking about super intelligence and raging robots.
Okay, no singularity this year's AIUK. Maybe
well, not on this stage.
Okay, see, they're all flooding in now. We may not get through all these questions now, but we'll do our best. Oliver Black has asked, where do you think are the key areas where we're going to see regulation in the AI standards and governance sphere?
Well, the most obvious place is in online safety and dealing with online harms, because the online safety bill, as Cosmina talked about, is already going through Parliament, and that's a really important and sort of world-leading piece of legislation in a way. It's a really strong piece of regulation, so quite exciting to see how that develops.
And there's a couple of kind of related questions. I'm going to roll them in together. One of them is, can you share insights on how to pilot AI-powered policy tools in the real world and how to evaluate their impacts? And the other one is, what advice would you give for generalist civil servants to start to meaningfully engage with the opportunities and issues raised, especially policy development? So, I mean, both of them, I think, are kind of asking for your top-level thoughts. And obviously, keep watching this space for the next 2 days, because I think we're going to get a lot of really specific insights into this. But if you've got any aphorisms or bullet points, perhaps we just start the thought on that.
Well, I'll start with one. I mean, I think there's a real need for a sort of different way. I think technologies became quite kind of scary in the public sector in terms of projects that went wrong, but also it became something that over time it became something that you could kind of buy, that you went to a provider and they provided you with a system, and it was a kind of hands-off relationship. And yeah, I think we've got to have a real cultural change where, as Cosmina mentioned at one point there, where it's something that you're more in control of, that you have that domain knowledge, which is crucially important in kind of thinking about what the technology might do. And it's a case of sort of building it collaboratively with data scientists and coders and so on. And it's a case of kind of embracing it rather than seeing it as a sort of hands-off thing that you can buy from a provider. I think that's really important.
I agree with that, and I think we will need to. Government will need to build more expertise into those technologies. So we will need specialists that will know how to model, how to build those technologies themselves. So I think that will be key.
Okay, so here's a question from Isabel Richards. Regarding how to detect online harms, and again this will be gone into a lot more detail later on, but regarding how to detect online harms, as well as the technical questions, it is an ethical and a political question. So how has that been factored into your research?
Well, I think something really important to say here is a point that Cosmina touched on, which is that the way you do that is a kind of marriage of computational methods and social science. In the social sciences, we're used to asking normative questions like, what is hate, for example. In the physical and mathematical sciences, far less used to asking those kind of questions. You really need a kind of disciplinary kind of marriage here, a real bringing together in order to be able to, because you have to ask them. It's absolutely true. I mean, that's right. To build a classifier for hate, you have to decide what you're going to define as hate. But that is good. The good thing about the whole kind of growing field of computational social science. In the social sciences, we're not scared of those questions. That questions like what is hate, what is democracy, we're good with that. And yeah, we need to make sure we don't at any point lose that and just shift over into the entirely sort of technical questions.
There's a lot of great questions coming in, and I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to ask them all, but I will actually, I'll throw one more at you, and I'm afraid everybody else, try and ask your question again in a later session, because most of them are things that will be covered in more detail later. So George Stanley said, well, AI algorithms can be black boxes, as in you don't actually understand how the machine learning, especially program, has come to the conclusions it's come to. Ethically, should government be using algorithms to inform decisions if we do not understand how the forecast was made?
We've worked alongside the Information Commissioner's Office on Project Explain, in which we've produced actual guidance on AI explanation. And it's exciting because it's the first guidance of its kind produced by a regulator and a research institute anywhere in the world. So I would definitely sort of direct the person who have submitted the question to read it. But we believe that the simplest system should be in place, and we also believe that citizens should absolutely understand the decisions that we're taking about them. And I think that's key. You can't just take decisions that affect people's lives without being able to explain to them why these decisions were made.